Story 1. The Breathing Ice. Marcus Holloway had spent 3 winters as a glaciologist studying the Harding ice field, but January of 2023 would be his last. The 34-year-old researcher from Oregon had always found comfort in the ancient ice, in the way cores revealed Earth's climate history written in frozen layers. His temporary research station sat 8 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by ski plane or a grueling snowmobile trek. Most researchers rotated out after 6 weeks. Marcus preferred to stay for months, accompanied only by his equipment, satellite phone, and the profound silence that only exists in Alaska's backcountry. The station was modest, a reinforced cabin with a generator, scientific equipment, and supplies for extended isolation. Marcus had learned to appreciate the solitude. His marriage had ended badly, and the ice offered something his ex-wife never could: predictability. Ice moved slowly, calved according to physical laws, and didn't leave passive-aggressive notes about his emotional unavailability. He'd joke about it over the satellite phone with his colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, during their weekly check-ins. She worried about his mental state. He assured her he'd never felt more centered. The phenomenon started on January 14th, during a routine core extraction. Marcus had drilled down 40 meters into the ice when his equipment detected something unusual: a pocket of air that shouldn't exist at that depth. The ice this deep was supposed to be under immense pressure, void of such cavities. He marked the location and spent the next 2 days drilling careful exploratory holes around the anomaly. Each bore confirmed the same thing: a chamber roughly the size of a small room, suspended in ice that was approximately 8,000 years old. On the 16th, Marcus positioned his endoscopic camera and fed it down the borehole. The tiny screen showed fractured light refracting through crystalline walls, and then the camera broke through into the chamber. What he saw made his breath catch. The cavity wasn't empty. Something dark occupied the center, roughly humanoid in shape, suspended in the ice like an insect in amber. But the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too angular, with limbs that bent in too many places. Marcus told himself it was a geological formation, a quirk of mineral deposits and shadow. But when he reviewed the footage that night, frame by frame, he couldn't shake the feeling that the thing had features. Not a face exactly, but the suggestion of one. And there was something else on the recording, something he hadn't noticed during the live feed. A sound, barely audible beneath the camera's mechanical whir. It sounded like breathing. He didn't report it to Sarah during their next check-in. He told himself he wanted to gather more data first, but truthfully, he was afraid she'd order him to evacuate. And he wasn't ready to leave. The discovery felt significant, possibly career-defining. He needed to understand it first. The next night, Marcus woke at 3 a.m. to a sound that shouldn't exist in the absolute silence of the ice field: breathing. Deep, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from beneath the floor. He lay in his sleeping bag, heart hammering, telling himself it was the wind, the building settling, his imagination poisoned by that footage. But the sound was too regular, too organic. It continued for 17 minutes, he counted every one, before stopping as abruptly as it began. Sleep became impossible. Marcus dressed and went outside into air so cold it burned his lungs through his face mask. The aurora danced overhead, sheets of green and violet that cast the ice in alien hues. He walked to the drill site, steam from his breath freezing instantly into ice crystals that hung in the air. The borehole was exactly as he'd left it, sealed with its protective cap. But the ice around it looked different. In the aurora's glow, he could see patterns beneath the surface, dark veins spreading outward from the drill site like capillaries, like the thing down there was bleeding into the surrounding ice. Over the next 3 days, Marcus documented everything obsessively. The breathing sound came every night, always starting at 3 a.m., always lasting between 15 and 20 minutes. The dark veins in the ice spread further each morning. His camera footage became increasingly corrupted, filled with interference that his equipment couldn't be causing. And there were the dreams. In them, Marcus stood on the ice while something vast moved beneath him. The surface would bow and flex like skin over muscle, and he would feel the thing's attention focus on him with the weight of continental plates shifting. He would wake gasping, disoriented, and the breathing sound would already be filling the cabin. On January 22nd, Marcus made his final video log. The recording shows him disheveled, eyes red-rimmed, speaking too quickly. "The chamber is expanding," he says, pointing to charts that prove the ice around the anomaly is developing structural instabilities. "But that's impossible. The temperature hasn't changed. Something is melting it from inside, or..." He stops, looking off camera. "Or it's waking up. That's insane. I know that's insane, but I can feel it down there. 8,000 years it's been sleeping in the ice, and I drilled into it. I let the air in. The recording cuts off. Static fills the frame for 3 seconds, and then through the white noise, a sound emerges. Deep, resonant breathing that seems to vibrate through the camera itself. Sarah Chen received Marcus's automated emergency beacon on January 23rd. She coordinated with Alaska state troopers, and a rescue team reached the research station 36 hours later. They found the cabin intact but abandoned. Marcus's equipment was still running, his last meal half-eaten on the table. His cold weather gear remained in the cabin, in temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Marcus Holloway had walked out into the ice wearing only his thermal underwear and socks. The search team followed his tracks for a quarter mile. The footprints led directly to the drill site, where they ended at the edge of a massive collapse. The ice had caved inward, creating a crevasse that dropped into absolute darkness. The team's ground-penetrating radar couldn't find the bottom. They did, however, detect the chamber Marcus had documented. It was empty. They never found Marcus Holloway's body. The official report listed him as deceased, victim of exposure and probable psychosis brought on by isolation. The research station was dismantled. The drill site was marked as geologically unstable and placed off limits. But Sarah Chen kept the recordings. Late at night, she would watch that last video log, watching Marcus's eyes as he described feeling something wake up beneath the ice. And she would listen to that breathing sound, wondering if it was something her colleague had disturbed or something that had found him. 2 years later, a different research team working 40 miles from Marcus's site reported unusual seismic activity, rhythmic vibrations that occurred every night at 3 a.m., lasting approximately 15 to 20 minutes. The pattern continued for 3 weeks before stopping. Around the same time, hikers found a frozen body half submerged in an ice field. The corpse had been preserved by the extreme cold, almost perfectly intact. But something was wrong with it. The limbs bent in too many places. The proportions were almost right, almost human, but not quite. The dental records identified it as Marcus Holloway, but that was impossible. No DNA test was ever performed. The body was cremated quickly, quietly, before anyone could ask too many questions. The official cause of death remained exposure. But the coroner who examined the body retired immediately after, moving to Arizona, where the closest thing to ice is a cocktail. He never spoke publicly about what he saw, but he stopped sleeping with the lights off. And somewhere beneath the Harding ice field, in chambers that have existed since the end of the last ice age, something breathes in the darkness, waiting for the next time someone drills too deep, too curious, too certain that the ice holds nothing but ancient air and frozen history. Story 2. The Town That Forgot Itself. Kimberly Torres had been a U.S. Census Bureau field representative for 8 years, but nothing in her training prepared her for Kivalina Station. The settlement wasn't on any map newer than 1987, but it appeared in census records as recently as 2015, listing a population of 73. When the Bureau noticed the discrepancy, they sent Kimberly to investigate in February of 2024, during the heart of Alaska's polar night. The 31-year-old from New Mexico had worked remote Alaska assignments before. She understood the challenges of communities that existed at the edge of the grid where roads ended and bush plains became the only link to civilization. But Kivalina Station was different. The few people she'd asked about it in Utqiagvik, the nearest actual town 60 miles north, had given her strange looks. An elderly Inupiaq woman at the store had gripped her wrist and whispered, "Some places remember themselves into existence, and some places forget. Let it forget." Kimberly had thanked her politely and continued her preparations. She was a professional. Ghost town legends weren't going to deter her from completing her assignment. Besides, the satellite imagery clearly showed structures and the last census data was less than 10 years old. Someone had to be living there. The bush pilot who flew her in, a grizzled man named Tom Mercer, grew increasingly quiet as they approached the coordinates. Kimberly watched the landscape scroll beneath them, endless white broken only by frozen rivers that looked like dark veins. Then she saw it. A cluster of buildings arranged around a central square, smoke rising from at least 3 chimneys. Proof of habitation. "There," she said, pointing. "That's it." Tom said nothing, circling lower. The buildings looked strange in the perpetual twilight, not abandoned but not quite occupied either. The proportions seemed off somehow, like a photograph slightly out of focus. He landed on what passed for an airstrip, really just a flat stretch of packed snow, and kept the engine running. "I'm coming back in exactly 72 hours, he said as Kimberly unloaded her equipment. 3 p.m. on February 19th. If you're not here, I'm leaving anyway, and I'm not coming back." "That's against protocol," Kimberly said. Tom's eyes found hers, and she saw fear there. 3 p.m., 72 hours, don't make me wait." The plane was gone within minutes, leaving her alone with her equipment and a town that shouldn't exist. Kimberly shouldered her pack and walked toward the nearest building. The cold was absolute, the kind that made her teeth ache despite her face mask. The darkness was nearly complete, the sun having set in November and not due to return until late January. Her headlamp cut a narrow path through the gloom. The first building she reached was a general store, or had been. The sign was still visible. Kivalina Station Mercantile, Estommer 1952. But the date looked wrong, the numbers shifting slightly when she looked directly at them. She pushed open the door and warmth hit her, impossible warmth from a wood stove that glowed in the corner. "Hello," she called. A woman appeared from the back room, middle-aged, wearing clothes that seemed both contemporary and oddly dated. "Census?" she asked, smiling. "We've been expecting you. Everyone will want to be counted." Over the next 6 hours, Kimberly interviewed 47 residents of Kivalina Station. Every single one of them was friendly, cooperative, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. Their stories made sense individually but collapsed into contradiction when examined collectively. The mayor said the town was founded in 1952 by miners. A school teacher insisted it had been established in 1938 by trappers. A mechanic swore it dated back to the 1890s. And there were the ages. Kimberly interviewed a woman named Margaret who claimed to be 41 but had memories of events from the 1960s that she described as her childhood. A man named Joseph said he was 28, but spoke about working on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline as a young man in the 70s. The architecture was equally impossible. Buildings that looked freshly painted stood next to identical structures in advanced decay. Streets appeared and disappeared depending on which direction Kimberly approached from, and the population kept changing. She counted 47 people in her interviews, but at the communal dinner that evening, she counted 62 distinct individuals. When she counted again after the meal, there were 58. Night, or the deeper darkness that passed for night during polar night, brought worse observations. Kimberly stayed in a boarding house run by a woman named Claire, who'd offered her a room just like we do for all the census people who visit. But according to census records, no field representative had visited Kivalina Station since 1987. From her window, Kimberly watched the town. People moved through the streets, but their movements were repetitive, like actors following the same blocking. A man walked from the mercantile to the post office every 17 minutes, following an identical path. Children played in the square, but their game never varied, their laughter hitting the same notes at the same intervals. On her second day, Kimberly tried to leave. She walked to the airstrip and found it exactly where it should be, but also found that no matter how long she walked, she never got any closer to the edge of town. The buildings would end, the tundra would begin. But when she looked back after walking for 20 minutes, the town lights were just as close as when she started. Panic set in. She tried running. She tried navigating by GPS, but her device showed her position as constantly changing while the town remained fixed in the same relationship to her location. After 3 hours of attempted escape, she found herself back at the boarding house, where Claire greeted her with tea and sympathy. "It's the darkness," Claire said, as if that explained everything. "During the long night, the town gets confused. So do the people. We forget which year it is, who we are, whether we're coming or going. But it's comfortable here. Safe. You could stay." "I have a plane coming," Kimberly said. "Do you?" Claire's eyes were kind but empty. "Are you sure? Maybe you've always been here. Maybe the plane is just something you remember from before you came home." That night, Kimberly barricaded herself in her room and reviewed her recordings. The interviews she'd conducted showed normal people saying normal things, but underneath their voices, just at the edge of audibility, was a sound like static, like white noise, like the town itself whispering through their mouths. And her field journal was changing. Notes she'd written on the first day now described events that hadn't happened. A page dated February 16th discussed interviewing people she hadn't met yet. Her handwriting, but not her memories. The town was rewriting her documentation, folding her into its impossible history. On the third day, Kimberly woke knowing she'd lived in Kivalina Station all her life. She was 26 years old. No, 31. No, 44. She'd come here to conduct a census. She'd come here to escape something. She'd been born here. All of it was true. None of it was real. At 2:45 p.m., some fragment of her original self screamed that she needed to be at the airstrip. She ran through streets that stretched and compressed, past people whose faces she both recognized and had never seen. The town pulled at her, trying to keep her, trying to make her forget that she'd ever been anywhere else. At 3 p.m. exactly, Tom Mercer's plane touched down. Kimberly was there, though she couldn't remember the last hour of running. Tom threw the door open and she dove inside. As they lifted off, she looked down at Kivalina Station. The buildings were flickering, there and not there, like an image struggling to maintain coherence. People stood in the streets looking up, and their faces were all the same face, wearing different features like masks. The flight back was silent. Tom didn't ask questions. When they landed in Utqiagvik, Kimberly filed her report. Kivalina Station, population 0, structures present but uninhabited. Recommend removing from census records. But at night, she dreams she's back there. In the dreams, she's standing in the town square during the endless darkness, and everyone is singing. They're singing her name, adding it to a song that lists all the people the town has remembered into existence. And the worst part is how badly she wants to join them, to let go of the exhausting work of being a real person with a linear history. and just exist in Kivalina Station's comfortable, impossible amnesia. 6 months later, the Census Bureau sent another representative to verify Kimberly's findings. He never returned. The plane that dropped him off found the coordinates exactly but reported no structures, no airstrip, nothing but empty tundra. Yet satellite imagery from that same day clearly shows buildings, smoke from chimneys, and if you zoom in far enough, people in the square looking up at the sky waiting for someone to remember them. Story 3. The Last Transmission. Jacob Reeves didn't believe in ghosts, which made his job as a communications technician for the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge significantly easier. Most people wouldn't spend weeks alone maintaining radio equipment on remote islands in the Aleutian chain, but Jacob found the solitude peaceful. At 42, divorced and childless, he'd built a career out of going places other people avoided. The islands were harsh, wind-scoured, and shrouded in fog, but they were honest in their hostility. Unlike people. In March of 2023, Jacob took a routine maintenance assignment on Attu Island, the westernmost point of the Aleutian chain and the last island before the international date line. The island was uninhabited except for automated weather stations and his temporary base camp. His job was simple: service the radio equipment, check the automated systems, and maintain the emergency relay station that served as a crucial link for ships and aircraft. Crossing the North Pacific, the first week passed without incident. Jacob fell into his familiar routine: work during the day, meals heated on his camp stove, evenings spent reading or listening to radio traffic. The constant wind and fog created white noise that he found soothing. He'd worked more remote locations than this, islands where polar bears were a genuine threat, stations accessible only a few weeks per year. Attu was harsh, but manageable. On day 9, Jacob was performing routine maintenance on the primary relay station when he intercepted a transmission on an obsolete frequency. Emergency channels were supposed to be monitored automatically, but this came through on a frequency that hadn't been actively used since the 1960s. The voice was distorted by static and what sounded like extreme distance, but the words were clear. Station Alpha 7 to any receiving station. We are stranded on Attu Island. Weather preventing evacuation. Need immediate assistance. 17 men, supplies for 3 days. Please respond. Jacob grabbed his microphone. This is Relay Station Attu. I copy your transmission. What is your location and status? Only static answered. He tried 3 more times, then checked his equipment. Everything was functioning normally. The transmission had been real, captured on his digital recorder. He played it back, listening carefully. The voice had the flat, professional tone of military communications. And there was something in the background, not just wind, but voices. Multiple men talking over each other, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakable. Fear. Jacob ran the transmission through his analysis software. The audio signature was consistent with equipment from the 1950s or 60s. Tube-based radio with characteristic harmonic distortion. Possible explanation: old emergency beacon activated by weather or seismic activity. But that didn't account for the voice, for the reference to 17 men, for the request for immediate assistance. He spent the evening researching. Attu Island had significant history, site of the only World War II battle fought on American soil, the Battle of Attu in May 1943. But the battle had ended 80 years ago. Jacob found no records of any Station Alpha 7, no missing person reports from the 60s that matched the transmission. The voice came again at 2 a.m. Jacob was in his sleeping bag when his receiver crackled to life. Same frequency, same voice, but with more urgency. Station Alpha 7 to any receiving station, weather worsening, lost contact with mainland, down to 14 men. Something came out of the fog. For God's sake, if anyone can hear this, warn. The transmission cut off, replaced by a sound that made Jacob's skin crawl. Screaming, multiple voices, abruptly silenced. He was fully awake now, recording everything. This is Relay Station A2. Identify your location. I can dispatch rescue services. What is your position on the island? The response came immediately, and this time the voice sounded like it was speaking directly to him. You're on the island. You must be able to see us, northeast of the old battlefield. We're at the emergency weather station. Hurry, it's coming back. Jacob's blood went cold. The old weather station, abandoned since the 1970s, was less than 2 miles from his current position. He grabbed his GPS, cold weather gear, and emergency kit. Professional protocol said to report the situation and wait for instructions, but 14 men in distress overrode protocol. He'd done search and rescue before. He knew how quickly situations deteriorated in Aleutian weather. The hike took an hour through fog so thick his headlamp created more glare than illumination. The wind carried strange sounds, or maybe he was imagining them after that transmission. Voices in the fog, screaming, crying, the island playing tricks with acoustics. When he reached the old weather station, his light revealed a concrete bunker half buried in volcanic soil, its walls stained with decades of rust and lichen. The door hung open. Inside, Jacob found evidence of habitation, old equipment, furniture, empty food containers. But everything was decades old, deteriorated by time and weather. No recent occupation, no distressed men, no Station Alpha 7. His radio crackled. The voice was clearer now, no longer distorted by static. Thank God, are you the rescue team? There's no one here, Jacob said into his radio. The station is abandoned. Silence. Then, what do you mean? We're right here, can't you see us? Right in front of you. We're standing right in front of you. Jacob swept his light across the empty room. Nothing. Just decay and abandonment. But the air had changed. It felt crowded, pressed in, like standing in a room full of people you can't quite see. Who are you? Jacob demanded. What happened here? The response came from multiple voices overlapping. We were a research team. Cold War installation, March 1961. We were studying atmospheric phenomena. Then it came in with the fog. We couldn't see it, but we could feel it. It was so hungry. It took Simmons first, then Kowalski, then... The voices cut off, replaced by that terrible screaming again, and then underneath it a different sound, breathing, deep, wet breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jacob ran. He'd like to claim professional composure, but the primitive part of his brain had taken over. He ran through the fog while his radio continued to transmit, voices calling for help, screaming, crying, begging for rescue that had never come. And beneath it all, that breathing, that sense of something vast and patient moving through the fog. He made it back to his base camp and immediately called for emergency evacuation. The duty officer was skeptical until Jacob transmitted his recordings. The order came through, secure your equipment and prepare for pickup. A helicopter would reach him by dawn. But dawn was hours away and the transmissions continued. All night, Jacob listened to Station Alpha 7 die over and over. The voices would call for help, report men missing, describe something in the fog. Then screaming, then silence, then it would start again. The same sequence with slight variations. A loop of horror repeating endlessly on an obsolete frequency. And between the loops, the voices would talk to him. They knew his name now. They begged him to help them, told him he was their only hope, asked why he wouldn't come to the weather station where they were waiting. The voices were persuasive, desperate. More than once, Jacob found himself reaching for his coat before stopping himself. They weren't asking for help. They were trying to lure him back. The helicopter extracted Jacob at first light. The pilot reported heavy fog but no difficulties. As they lifted off, Jacob looked down at the old weather station. For just a moment, the fog cleared and he could see figures standing outside the bunker. 17 figures watching him leave. Jacob never took another remote assignment. He transferred to an office position in Anchorage, maintaining equipment from behind a desk. But he kept the recordings, and sometimes late at night he'd listen to them. The timestamps showed something impossible. The transmissions had started before he'd arrived on Atu, recorded by the automated systems. Station Alpha 7 had been calling for help for 62 years, their emergency repeated on a loop, waiting for someone to answer. Research eventually confirmed that a research team had been stationed on Atu in March of 1961. 17 men. They were evacuated in early April after reporting equipment malfunctions and psychological stress. All 17 made it home safely. But Jacob knew the truth. Whatever came back from Atu weren't the men who left. The real team, the 17 who experienced whatever came out of that fog, they never left the island. They're still there, trapped in the moment of their terror, calling for rescue that will never come, warning about something that still hunts in the fog. The emergency frequency they used is officially decommissioned now. But sometimes technicians working the Aleutian chain report picking up a transmission on an obsolete band, a voice requesting immediate assistance. 17 men running out of time. And if you listen carefully, underneath the words you can hear breathing. Something vast and patient still hunting in the fog. Still hungry after all these years. Story 4. The Frozen Trail. Detective Sarah Blackwood had worked Alaska State Troopers for 13 years, specializing in missing persons cases across the state's vast wilderness. At 38, she'd seen enough tragedy to understand that Alaska could be beautiful and merciless in equal measure. But the case of the Denali Trail disappearances challenged everything she thought she understood about her work. It started in November of 2022 when a popular hiking trail on the outskirts of Denali National Park was closed after 3 hikers disappeared within a 2-week span. The trail was well maintained, frequently used, and only 4 miles long. Not the kind of place where experienced hikers vanished. Yet David Morrison, Emma Yates, and Thomas Chen had entered the trail on separate occasions and simply never emerged from the other end. Sarah arrived at the trailhead on a gray November morning when winter was asserting its dominance. The temperature hovered at 15 below zero, and snow was already accumulating despite it being early in the season. Park Service rangers had organized search parties that found nothing. No bodies, no evidence of animal attacks, no signs of the hikers leaving the marked trail. "It doesn't make sense," Ranger Michael Oshiro told her, his breath fogging in the cold air. "The trail is basically a straight line. You'd have to actively try to get lost. And all 3 were experienced. Morrison guided hunts commercially. Chen climbed Denali 2 summers ago. These weren't tourists who wandered off taking selfies. Sarah examined the case files during the brief daylight hours. Each disappearance followed an identical pattern. Hiker checks in at the trailhead kiosk, their vehicle later found in the parking area, but they never check out at the trail's end. No distress calls, no emergency beacon activations. Security cameras at both trailheads showed them entering but never leaving. The only anomaly was a detail so minor that it had been overlooked in the initial reports. Each hiker had been alone, and each had started their hike at approximately 2:30 p.m. That meant they'd been on the trail during the brief transition between day and the long Arctic night. Sarah decided to walk the trail herself, accompanied by 2 rangers and equipped with full winter gear, GPS tracking, and constant radio contact. They started at 1 p.m., giving themselves ample time to complete the 4-mile route before full darkness. The trail was beautiful in a stark way. Snow-covered spruce trees creating a tunnel of white and deep green. Their footsteps crunched loudly in the silence. Sarah photographed everything, noting landmarks, measuring distances, looking for any place where someone might have left the trail. Everything seemed normal until they reached the 2-mile marker. "Does anyone else feel that?" Ranger Oshiro asked, stopping abruptly. Sarah felt it. A change in air pressure or temperature or something less definable. The quality of light had shifted even though the sun hadn't moved appreciably. The forest looked the same but felt different, like they'd crossed an invisible threshold. Her radio crackled with static. She tried calling base but received only white noise. GPS showed their position accurately, but the trail ahead looked different. The packed snow less disturbed, as if fewer people had traveled this section, which made no sense. It was a through trail. Every hiker who passed the 2-mile marker should have continued to the end. "We keep going," Sarah decided, "but we stay alert." The next mile was the longest of Sarah's life. The forest pressed in, the silence became oppressive, and the light continued to fail in ways that didn't match the actual time. When Sarah checked her watch, it showed 2:45 p.m., but the darkness around them suggested much later. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching across the trail like skeletal fingers. Then she saw the figure. A man stood in the trail ahead, maybe 50 yards distant, wearing hiking gear but no pack. Even at that distance, Sarah could see he was underdressed for the temperature, wearing only a light jacket. "Sir," she called out, "Alaska State Troopers, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. He simply stood there facing them. Sarah approached cautiously, one hand on her radio, though it was still producing only static. As she got closer, details resolved. The man was in his early 30s, clean-shaven with frost forming on his exposed skin. His eyes were open but didn't track their movement. "Sir, I need you to respond. Are you injured?" Sarah was 10 feet away now, close enough to see that the frost on his skin wasn't just surface level. Ice crystals had formed in his eyebrows, his hair. He should have been shivering violently at this temperature in such light clothing, but he stood perfectly still. She reached out to check for a pulse, and the man moved. Not toward her, backward, sliding across the snow without appearing to walk. He maintained perfect eye contact as he retreated, his expression never changing until the forest swallowed him. "Did you see?" Sarah spun to her companions and found herself alone. The 2 rangers had vanished. She was standing on a trail that looked less like a maintained hiking path and more like a game trail, narrow and overgrown. The trees were wrong, too close together, too tall, species she couldn't identify, and it was much darker than it should have been. Sarah ran. Professional training evaporated in the face of primal fear. She ran back the way she'd come, her headlamp cutting wild shadows through trees that seemed to lean in from both sides. Her breath came in gasps, freezing instantly on her face mask. The trail stretched impossibly long, much further than the mile she'd already walked. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Not the crunch of snow under boots, but the whisper of something moving through powder without breaking through the crust. She didn't look back. Looking back felt like the worst possible decision she could make. The trail finally opened onto familiar terrain, the 2-mile marker appearing like a beacon. Sarah crossed it and immediately felt the change again, like stepping through a curtain. Her radio exploded with voices. "Detective Blackwood, respond! What is your position?" "I'm here," she gasped. 2-mile marker, where are the rangers?" "Ma'am, you've been non-responsive for 40 minutes. Rangers Oshiro and Kelly are with you. We've had continuous visual via drone footage." Sarah turned. Both rangers were right behind her, looking confused and concerned. "Did you run ahead?" Oshiro asked. "You just suddenly took off. We tried to keep up, but—" "I was alone," Sarah insisted. "You disappeared. I was alone on the trail." The drone footage told a different story. It showed Sarah walking normally with both rangers until the 2-mile marker, where she'd suddenly broken into a run while the rangers called after her in confusion. The footage showed an empty trail ahead of her. No figure, no one standing in the path. But when Sarah reviewed her body camera footage later that night, she saw something different. The figure was there, clear as day, and as her camera had approached just before the man slid backward into the forest, the lens had captured his jacket. Printed on the breast pocket was a name: D. Morrison. Sarah interviewed Morrison's family. They confirmed the jacket matched what he'd been wearing. But David Morrison had disappeared 3 weeks earlier. What Sarah had encountered on the trail couldn't have been him. No one survives 3 weeks in Alaska winter wearing a light jacket. And no living person moves the way that figure had moved. She researched the trail's history and found something interesting. The land had been used by Athabascan peoples for centuries, but they'd avoided this specific route. Oral histories described it as a confused place where the boundaries between the world of the living and the dead grew thin during certain times of the year, particularly during the transition to polar night when day and night existed in uncertain balance. Sarah submitted her report recommending the trail remain closed indefinitely. The official explanation cited dangerous wildlife activity, but she also filed a separate classified report detailing her experience and her theory. Something about that stretch of trail, particularly around the 2-mile marker, created a spatial or temporal anomaly during specific conditions. People who entered during that twilight window didn't just disappear, they slipped into someplace else, someplace that looked like the trail but wasn't. The trail has never reopened. Park Service staff won't discuss it publicly, but they've installed barriers at both ends and cameras monitoring the closure. The cameras occasionally capture images of people on the supposedly empty trail. Figures in hiking gear, standing still, always at approximately the 2-mile marker. Sometimes they're recognizable from missing persons reports. Sometimes they're wearing clothes from decades earlier. Sarah left Alaska the following year, accepting a position in Montana. She told colleagues it was for a career opportunity, but the truth was simpler. She couldn't stay in a state where trails could lead to places that shouldn't exist, where the missing weren't necessarily dead but trapped in some in-between space, walking forever through a forest that looked almost but not quite like home. And on certain November evenings, when the light is failing and winter is asserting its grip, you can still see footprints in the snow around that closed trail. Fresh prints appearing despite the barriers, despite the cameras, despite the warnings. Prints that walk up to the 2-mile marker and simply stop, as if whoever was making them stepped out of this world and into another, following 3 experienced hikers who learned too late that some trails don't lead where their maps suggest. Story 5. The Aurora Watchers. Dr. Elizabeth Morton had spent her entire career studying the Aurora Borealis, but she'd never witnessed what happened at the Poker Flat Research Range in January of 2024. The 46-year-old atmospheric physicist from MIT had made countless trips to Alaska's premier auroral research facility, launching rockets into the shimmering lights to gather data on the ionosphere. She understood the science: solar wind interacting with Earth's magnetic field, exciting atoms in the upper atmosphere, producing light. There was no mystery, only physics. The research team that January was small, just Elizabeth, 2 graduate students named Aaron Weiss and Jennifer Park, and facility manager Raymond Ockpick, an Inupiaq man whose family had lived in the Fairbanks area for generations. They were running a series of experiments during a predicted period of intense solar activity, launching instruments into the aurora to measure magnetic field fluctuations. The first 3 nights went perfectly. The aurora danced overhead in sheets of green and violet. Their instruments captured excellent data. and the team worked efficiently despite temperatures hovering around 30 below zero. Elizabeth was pleased. This data would significantly advance their understanding of how auroral currents affected satellite communications. On the fourth night, January 18th, something changed. The aurora appeared as scheduled around 10 p.m., but its behavior was unusual. Instead of the typical flowing curtains, the lights formed geometric patterns, precise lines and angles that held their shape for minutes at a time. Elizabeth had seen unusual auroral formations before, but nothing this structured. "Getting some weird readings," Aaron reported from the control room. "The magnetic field fluctuations are... I don't even know how to describe this. It's like the aurora is pulsing in a pattern, a repeating pattern." Jennifer pulled up the data visualization. The magnetic field variations weren't random. They followed a clear sequence, repeating every 47 seconds with mathematical precision. "That's not possible," Elizabeth said, but the data didn't lie. Something was creating ordered structure in what should be chaotic particle interactions. Raymond had been standing by the window watching the aurora. When Elizabeth approached, she saw his expression, not wonder but fear. "My grandmother told stories," he said quietly, "about certain auroras that weren't natural. She called them the Watchers. Said they appeared when the barriers were thin, when things from outside were looking in." "Raymond, we're scientists. There's a natural explanation." "Then explain why it's forming symbols," he interrupted, pointing upward. Elizabeth looked up through the observation window. The aurora had reorganized itself into shapes that were undeniably deliberate. Not random patterns, but glyphs, symbols, designs that suggested intelligence. They hung in the sky for nearly a minute before flowing back into more natural formations. Over the next hour, the phenomenon intensified. The aurora grew brighter, descending lower in the sky than Elizabeth had ever witnessed. It seemed to reach down toward the facility like luminous fingers. And the patterns became more complex, interlocking geometric designs that reminded Elizabeth of circuitry or perhaps language, some form of visual communication she couldn't comprehend. The team's instruments began malfunctioning. Sensors designed to measure particle density reported impossible readings. Magnetometers registered field strengths that should have fried their circuits. And every camera pointed at the aurora captured something that shouldn't exist. Within the dancing lights, shapes, figures, humanoid forms composed of light and magnetism moving through the aurora like swimmers through water. "We need to shut down," Elizabeth decided. This was beyond their equipment's design parameters, possibly dangerous. But when Aaron tried to power down the systems, they wouldn't respond. The aurora instruments were locked on, their sensors fixated on the sky, as if something had taken control. Jennifer screamed. Elizabeth spun to find her graduate student pressed against the window, staring upward with an expression of absolute terror. The aurora had descended further, its lower edge now barely 100 feet above the facility. And within the lights, clearly visible now, were dozens of the figures. They were watching the facility, watching them, with an attention that felt physical, oppressive. Raymond was speaking rapidly in Inupiaq, words Elizabeth didn't understand but recognized as prayer or warding. She pulled Jennifer away from the window, but the young woman was unresponsive, her eyes fixed on the aurora, tears freezing on her cheeks. Then the lights went out. Every electrical system in the facility died simultaneously. Power, backup generators, even battery-powered devices. The only illumination came from the aurora, which now pulsed in rhythm with a sound that Elizabeth felt more than heard. A deep vibration that resonated in her bones, in her teeth, in the fluid of her inner ear. In that pulsing auroral light, Elizabeth saw something that would never appear in any research paper. The figures in the aurora weren't just watching. They were descending. Shapes made of light and magnetic fields were lowering themselves toward the research facility like divers descending into deep water. And where they touched the air, reality seemed to ripple, to distort, as if their presence was incompatible with physical space. Aaron was at the door trying to force it open, shouting that they needed to evacuate. But Elizabeth understood with horrible certainty that there was nowhere to run. Whatever was happening, whatever these things were, they had chosen this moment, this place, this team. The Aurora had always been here, she realized. They'd been studying it for decades, launching instruments into it, treating it like a natural phenomenon. But what if it was something else? What if they'd been sending rockets into something that was aware, something that was watching? The nearest figure reached what Elizabeth's terrified mind approximated as ground level. It was roughly humanoid but wrong in proportions and composition. Too tall, too thin, formed from light that bent in ways that hurt to perceive. It moved toward the facility, and where it passed, frost formed on the windows in patterns that matched the geometric designs they'd seen in the sky. Raymond grabbed Elizabeth's arm. "Don't look directly at them," he said urgently. "My grandmother said if the Watchers see that you see them, they'll take you to show you what they're seeing. They'll take you outside." "Outside where?" Elizabeth asked. "Outside everything." The figure reached the facility wall. Elizabeth, despite Raymond's warning, couldn't help but look. The thing was at the window now, its not quite face pressing against the glass. It had features that suggested eyes, a mouth, but they were composed of auroral light, shifting and reforming. And in those light-formed eyes, Elizabeth saw... She couldn't describe it later, not coherently. She saw space, vast and cold and filled with things that moved in dimensions she couldn't comprehend. She saw Earth from impossible distances, saw the magnetic field lines like a web wrapped around the planet, and she saw things climbing along those lines, using them like roads, like routes into this reality. The aurora wasn't a natural phenomenon being observed by something outside. The aurora was the boundary, the barrier, and these things were the guards or the prisoners or perhaps both. The vision released her. Elizabeth found herself on the floor, nose bleeding, Jennifer crying beside her, Aaron curled in a fetal position. Only Raymond remained standing, still speaking his prayers or warnings or whatever they were. The figure at the window tilted its head in a gesture that was terribly human despite its inhuman composition. Then it raised what approximated a hand and touched the glass. The window didn't break. It dissolved, transmuted into something that was no longer solid matter, but not quite light either. And then the figure withdrew, ascending back into the aurora, followed by all the others. The lights came back on. Every system rebooted simultaneously. And the aurora, which had descended to nearly touch the facility, retreated to its normal altitude, resuming conventional patterns as if the last hour had been a momentary aberration. The facility's clock showed 11:47 p.m. Only an hour and 47 minutes had passed, though it had felt like longer. Elizabeth checked the instruments with shaking hands. All the data from the last 2 hours was corrupted, filled with impossible readings that made no scientific sense. The only intact recording was from a backup camera that had been running on its own battery. Elizabeth watched that footage alone in her quarters that night. It showed the aurora descending, the figures becoming visible, the approach to the facility. But it also showed something the team hadn't seen. While they'd been focused on the figures outside, something had been happening inside. All four of them, Elizabeth, Aaron, Jennifer, and Raymond, had been standing at the windows perfectly still for 73 minutes. Not moving, barely breathing while the aurora pulsed around the building. And in one frame, just one, the camera had captured their reflections in the window glass. But the reflections weren't quite right. They showed the team, but with subtle differences. Their eyes were reflecting the aurora's light, glowing faintly green and violet. And they were smiling, all four of them, with expressions of ecstasy or terror or something for which there was no name. Elizabeth never published the data from that night. She shut down the experiments, returned to MIT, and quietly resigned 6 months later. Aaron transferred to a different field of study. Jennifer left science entirely, becoming a social worker in Portland. Raymond remained at Poker Flat, but he refused to work during auroral events, and he'd had his grandmother come to perform a traditional cleansing ceremony in the facility. The research range still operates, scientists still study the aurora, and rockets still launch instruments into the dancing lights. But there's now a protocol, unofficial and never written down, that certain types of measurements aren't conducted when the aurora behaves in specific ways. Geometric patterns are noted but not investigated. Unusually low-altitude displays prompt immediate shutdowns. And if anyone reports seeing figures in the lights, the entire facility evacuates until the aurora returns to normal. Because Elizabeth Morton's team learned something that night that they could never share in a scientific paper. The aurora borealis is beautiful and natural and completely explicable by physics. But sometimes, during certain conditions, other things use it as a window. And sometimes those things look through, curious about the small, warm creatures who've spent centuries staring up at them, studying them, never realizing they were being studied in return. And if you look at auroral imagery carefully, especially from nights of intense activity, you can sometimes see them. Shapes in the light that are too organized, too deliberate, too watchful to be random particle interactions. They're still there, beyond the barrier, looking in, and perhaps they're wondering when we'll be ready to understand what they're trying to show us. Or perhaps they're waiting for something else entirely. Story 6. The Cabin at Lake Iliamna. Tyler Vasquez had inherited his uncle's cabin on Lake Iliamna without ever having seen it. The 29-year-old software engineer from Seattle learned about his uncle Marcus's death and the property bequest in October of 2023. He'd never been particularly close to his uncle, who'd moved to Alaska 30 years earlier and become progressively more reclusive. But the cabin represented an unexpected opportunity. Remote property on Alaska's largest lake, a potential retreat or investment property. Tyler flew into Anchorage in early November, then caught a bush plane to the tiny village of Iliamna. From there, a local guide named Tom Kulik agreed to take him by boat to the property, which sat on an isolated peninsula accessible only by water or float plane. The lake was vast, over 1,000 square miles, and locals called it Alaska's Loch Ness, due to persistent stories of a large creature living in its depths. "Your uncle kept to himself," Tom said during the boat ride, his voice competing with the outboard motor. "Came into the village maybe twice a year for supplies. People tried to be friendly, but Marcus, he wasn't interested. Said he needed to watch the lake, whatever that meant." The cabin appeared around a bend, a weathered structure of logs and corrugated metal perched on a rocky outcrop with an unobstructed view of the lake. Tom helped Tyler unload supplies, clearly eager to leave before darkness fell. "You sure you want to stay out here alone?" Tom asked. "Cell phones don't work and the lake can get rough with no warning. I can come back tomorrow, pick you up after you've looked around." Tyler assured him he'd be fine for a few days. He had survival training, satellite phone for emergencies, and enough supplies to last a week. Tom departed with visible reluctance, the boat's motor fading into the distance until Tyler was left with only the wind and the lapping of water against rocks. The cabin's interior was sparse but functional. A wood stove, cots, basic kitchen equipment, shelves of canned goods. But one wall was completely covered with notebooks, hundreds of them stacked and organized by date. Tyler pulled one down at random. The entry was dated June 15, 2018. Third sighting this week, surface disturbance at approximately 3:15 a.m. Object moving north to south, estimated length 40-50 feet. Visible for 22 seconds before submerging. No fishing vessels in area. No seals or whales would reach this size in lake this far from ocean. It knows I'm watching. Can feel its attention like weight on my skin. Tyler spent the afternoon reading through the notebooks. 30 years of observations, detailed logs of water surface disturbances, unusual wave patterns, shapes glimpsed beneath the water. His uncle had been obsessed, documenting every anomaly on Lake Iliamna with scientific precision. But the entries grew increasingly disturbed over time, describing not just sightings but sensations, dreams, the feeling of being watched from beneath the water. As darkness fell, Tyler started a fire in the wood stove and made dinner. The cabin had no electricity, so he used kerosene lamps that cast flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the lake was invisible, just blackness and the sound of water. He returned to the notebooks, reading by lamplight, an entry from December 2022. It called to me again last night. Not in words, but I understood. It wants me to know it's there, wants me to acknowledge its presence. I try to ignore it, but the dreams are getting worse. In them, I'm underwater, sinking, and it rises to meet me. Not aggressive. Curious, lonely, hungry? I don't know the word for what it is. Tyler's logical mind rejected the obvious conclusion. His uncle had been isolated too long, had developed fixations, had seen patterns in random lake phenomena. But another part of him, the part raised on his mother's stories about Marcus before Alaska, remembered a sharp, rational man who'd been an engineer like Tyler himself. What could drive someone like that to 30 years of obsession? At 3:15 a.m., Tyler woke to a sound, not loud but persistent, a rhythmic splashing that cut through the wind noise. He lay still, listening, telling himself it was waves, wind, nothing significant. But the sound had a pattern, a regularity that natural phenomena shouldn't possess. He rose and went to the window. The moon had risen nearly full, painting the lake in silver. And there, perhaps 200 yards offshore, the water was disturbed. Not by waves, but by something moving just beneath the surface, creating a wake that suggested enormous size. Tyler watched for 3 minutes as the disturbance moved parallel to the shore, maintaining consistent distance and speed. Then it stopped. The water went still, and Tyler had the unmistakable sensation of being observed. Not watched by eyes, something deeper, more fundamental. He felt seen in a way that made his skin crawl, as if something was studying him, measuring him, deciding something about him. The sensation passed. The water remained calm. Tyler returned to bed but didn't sleep. At dawn, he found his uncle's last notebook, the entries ending 3 weeks before his death. November 2nd, 2023. It came to the surface last night, fully breached. I finally saw it clearly. Not Iliamna monster from tourist stories, something else, ancient. It looked at the cabin, at me through the window. I saw its eye, singular, massive, reflecting moonlight like mirror. And I understood what it's been trying to tell me all these years. It's lonely. Last of something. Trapped here when the lake formed, when the glacier melted. Waiting in the deep for... what? Others of its kind? Death? Recognition that it exists? I think it chose me because I was willing to watch, to document, to acknowledge its existence. November 15th, 2023. I've decided to join it. That sounds insane, I know. But I've spent 30 years watching the lake, and the lake has spent 30 years watching me. We know each other now. It's shown me things in dreams. What the world looked like when its kind were numerous, when the ice sheets covered continents, when things lived in the cold water that humans have never classified. It's the last witness to that world. And I think it's asking me to witness its ending. November 18th, 2023, tomorrow night, moon will be full. Water temperature 38 degrees. I'll last perhaps 15 minutes before hypothermia takes me. Enough time to swim out, to meet it properly. People will think I slipped, fell in, drowned. That's fine. But I'll know the truth. I'm choosing to see it one last time. To let it know that its existence mattered, that someone knew it was there. The notebook entry ended. Tyler checked the official death report. Marcus Vasquez found floating in Lake Iliamna on November 22, 2023. Cause of death, drowning, likely accidental. His body had shown no signs of violence, no defensive wounds. He'd simply gone into the water and not come back. Tyler spent the second day photographing the cabin, taking inventory, planning to list the property for sale and leave as quickly as possible. But as night fell, he found himself drawn to the window, watching the water. The rational part of his brain insisted there was no creature, no ancient being trapped in the lake. His uncle had been mentally ill, delusional from isolation. But at 3:15 a.m., the water disturbed again. And this time, Tyler saw more. A shape beneath the surface, darker than the surrounding water, impossibly large. It moved with fluid grace that no fish or marine mammal could match. And as he watched, it rose. Not breaching, but coming close enough to the surface that moonlight penetrated to its form. Tyler saw a body that might have been serpentine or might have been something without a terrestrial analog. He saw ridges along what might have been a spine, structures that could have been fins or limbs or something else entirely. And he saw the eye. His uncle had been right about that. A single massive eye, reflecting moonlight, focused on the cabin with unmistakable intelligence. The eye held his for perhaps 5 seconds. In that time, Tyler felt something pass between them. Not communication in any linguistic sense, but understanding. The thing in the lake was aware, intelligent, and profoundly alone. It had been alone for longer than human civilization had existed, trapped in this lake by geological changes, the last survivor of a species that had thrived when the world was cold and the seas were deeper. And it was asking the same thing it had asked his uncle. Witness me. Acknowledge that I exist. Don't let me die unmourned and forgotten. The creature descended, the water settling as if it had never been disturbed. Tyler stood at the window until dawn, his mind racing. Every rational instinct told him to leave, to chalk this up to suggestion and imagination, to sell the property and forget about it. But he didn't. Tyler Vasquez stayed at the cabin. He picked up his uncle's work, maintaining the logs, documenting the sightings. He told himself it was temporary, that he was just satisfying curiosity. But weeks became months, and he found himself watching the lake with the same obsession that had consumed Marcus. The creature appears regularly now, usually at 3:15 a.m., sometimes longer. Tyler has hours of video footage, though it never looks convincing. Just water disturbances in dark shapes that skeptics dismiss as logs, waves, or camera artifacts. He stopped trying to prove anything to others. The evidence isn't for them. Tom Kulik brings supplies every few weeks, and he's noticed the change in Tyler. "You're starting to look like your uncle," Tom said on his last visit. Same expression, same way of staring at the water. Tyler knows he's right. He's become what Marcus became, the watcher, the witness, the one person willing to acknowledge that something ancient and inexplicable lives in the depths of Lake Iliamna. Is it worth it? He's abandoned his career, his life in Seattle, his relationships. But when he sees that eye looking back at him through the dark water, when he feels that vast loneliness reaching out for connection, he knows he can't leave. Because some things are worse than death, worse than isolation or obsession or madness. Being the last of your kind, existing for millennia with no one to prove you were ever real, that's worse. And if acknowledging that existence costs Tyler his former life, perhaps that's a price worth paying. The notebook on his desk is open to today's date. The entry reads, 3:15 a.m. Surface disturbance, duration 4 minutes. Eye contact maintained for 12 seconds. I think it's getting weaker. The water is warming, climate changing, and it's a creature adapted to Ice Age cold. In 10 years, maybe 20, Lake Iliamna will be too warm. And then the last one will die, and no one but me will know it was ever here. Tyler closes the notebook and returns to the window. The lake is calm tonight, but he'll watch anyway. He'll watch until dawn and then through the next night and the one after that, because that's what witnesses do. They watch. They remember. And when the last of something finally dies, they're there to say, you existed, you mattered, and you were not alone at the end. Story 7. The Research Station at Prudhoe Bay. Dr. Anthony Chen had worked in extreme environments for 15 years, but the isolation unit at Prudhoe Bay was unique even by his standards. The 37-year-old psychologist specialized in studying the effects of prolonged isolation on human cognition and behavior. Critical research for future space missions. In December of 2023, he volunteered to join an experiment at a remote research station on Alaska's North Slope, where the sun had already set for the winter and wouldn't rise again until late January. The experiment was straightforward. 6 volunteers would spend 8 weeks in complete isolation, their psychological states monitored remotely by Anthony and his team. The volunteers were housed in separate modules within the research station, unable to see or communicate with each other. They would complete daily cognitive tests, psychological assessments, and maintain video logs. The station was automated, climate-controlled, and designed to simulate the isolation astronauts would experience during deep space missions. Anthony arrived at the facility in early December when perpetual darkness had already settled over the region. The station sat 50 miles from the nearest oil field installation, accessible only by helicopter in decent weather. For the next 2 months, he would be the only person monitoring the experiment in real time, living in a separate section of the facility while the volunteers remained in their modules. The first week proceeded normally. All 6 volunteers, 3 men and 3 women ranging from ages 25 to 48, adapted well to their isolation. They completed their tasks, maintained regular sleep schedules, and their video logs showed expected levels of stress and adjustment. Anthony monitored their biometric data, reviewed their assessments, and filed daily reports with his research institution. On day 9, Subject 4, a 42-year-old geologist named Patricia Hammond, filed a complaint about noise. She reported hearing footsteps in the corridor outside her module despite knowing intellectually that all 6 subjects were sealed in soundproof rooms. Anthony checked the station's security footage. The corridors were empty, had been empty all night. He made a note: auditory hallucination, early onset, monitor closely. But over the next 3 days, all 6 subjects reported similar experiences. Footsteps in corridors, doors opening and closing, voices speaking too quietly to understand words. Each subject was isolated, had no contact with the others, yet they were reporting identical phenomena. Anthony reviewed every sensor in the facility. No mechanical explanations. The building was solid, climate control functioning normally, no structural issues that would create unusual sounds. He considered the possibility of acoustic transfer between modules, but the soundproofing was specifically designed to prevent exactly that. On day 13, Subject 2, a 29-year-old software engineer named David Reeves, appeared in his video log looking visibly shaken. "There's someone else here," he said to the camera. "I know that's impossible, but I've been hearing them every night. And tonight I saw a shadow pass by the window in my door. Just a glimpse, but definitely human-shaped. Dr. Chen, is someone else in the facility with us? Some kind of control element you didn't mention? Anthony reviewed the security footage from the time David mentioned. The corridor outside his module was empty, but when Anthony enhanced the image, his breath caught. There was something there, not a person exactly, but a distortion in the air, a slight darkening that moved across the frame in a way that suggested deliberate motion. It was visible for less than 2 seconds before disappearing. He told himself it was a camera artifact, compression error, something technical. But then Subject 5 reported the same thing, and Subject 1. And by day 15, all 6 volunteers were insisting that something else was in the facility with them, something that walked the corridors during the deep darkness of Arctic night. Anthony increased his own monitoring, conducting tours of the facility at irregular intervals. He found nothing. No signs of intrusion, no evidence of any presence besides the 6 isolated subjects and himself. But he began to notice his own perception, shifting. The darkness outside the windows felt different, more present somehow. The facility seemed larger at night, the corridors longer, the shadows deeper. On day 18, the volunteers began having shared dreams. Subject 3, a 31-year-old biologist named Maria Santos, described a dream in her video log. I was walking through the corridors, but they were different, endless, and I wasn't alone. I could hear the other subjects calling out. We were all lost, trying to find each other, but the corridors kept changing, twisting. And there was something following us. Not chasing, just following, watching. When Anthony reviewed the other logs, he found that subjects 1, 4, and 6 had documented nearly identical dreams from the same night. 4 people isolated from each other experiencing the same nightmare. Statistically improbable but not impossible. But the description of the entity, something watching, following. Not hostile but intensely present. That detail was too specific to be coincidental. Anthony began having the dreams too. He'd wake in his quarters at 3 a.m. with the absolute conviction that he was not alone in his room, that something stood in the corner where the shadows were deepest, observing him with patient interest. When he turned on the lights, nothing would be there. But the sensation of being watched persisted, and he understood with horrible clarity what his subjects were experiencing. On day 21, the facility's power fluctuated. Lights dimmed and brightened in sequence, starting from the furthest modules and moving toward the central control room where Anthony monitored the experiment. He checked every system. No mechanical cause, no explanation. The power grid was functioning normally according to every diagnostic. But the lights had dimmed in a deliberate pattern, room by room, as if something was moving through the facility, and its presence affected the electrical systems. That night, Anthony reviewed security footage from all cameras simultaneously, looking for correlations. What he found made his hands shake. At 3:07 a.m., every camera had captured the same thing, a distortion, a darkness that was slightly more than absence of light. It appeared in the furthest corridor, then moved through the facility, visible in each camera for approximately 3 seconds before moving to the next. And it was clearly deliberate. The entity, because Anthony couldn't think of it as anything else now, moved with purpose. It paused outside each subject's module, remaining there for precisely 17 seconds before moving on. When it reached Anthony's section of the facility, he'd been in the control room watching the footage. The entity appeared in the corridor outside the control room door. Anthony had looked up at that exact moment. Through the door's window, he'd seen something. Not a person, not a shadow, but a space where reality seemed compressed, darker and heavier than its surroundings. It had no features he could identify, but he felt its attention with absolute certainty. It was looking at him, studying him, measuring him. The moment passed. The entity moved on, visible in 3 more cameras before disappearing from the station entirely. Anthony sat trembling in the control room, his scientific training warring with primal fear. What he'd witnessed had no natural explanation, no psychological framework that could contain it. He tried to rationalize, shared hallucination brought on by isolation and darkness. Mass psychogenic illness transmitted through some unknown vector. Infrasound from the station's systems creating neurological effects. But none of those explanations accounted for the security footage, the objective record of something moving through a facility that was supposed to contain only 7 isolated people. Subject 6, a 48-year-old former military officer named Robert Church, requested emergency extraction on day 23. His video log showed a man at the edge of psychological collapse. "It's not just in the corridors anymore, it comes into my room. I wake up and it's standing there by my bed just watching. I can't see it clearly, but I know it's there. And the worst part? I don't think it's malicious, it's just curious. It's studying us like we're the experiment. Please, I need to leave. I can't do this anymore." Anthony initiated emergency protocols. Weather had cleared enough for helicopter extraction. But when the crew arrived to collect Robert, they found all 7 people. 6 subjects and Anthony himself standing in the central corridor. Not moving, not speaking, just standing in the darkness with the emergency lights casting red shadows across their faces. The extraction team had to physically guide them to the helicopter. None of the 7 seemed aware of their surroundings, responding only to direct commands. Medical evaluation at the nearest hospital showed no drugs, no neurological abnormalities, no physical explanation for their catatonic states. They all recovered within 48 hours, with no memory of the extraction or the hours preceding it. The last thing Anthony remembered clearly was reviewing the security footage at 3:07 a.m. on day 21. Everything after that was fragments, disconnected impressions of darkness and the sensation of being observed. The experiment was terminated. The facility was investigated thoroughly. Environmental tests, structural analysis, electromagnetic surveys. Nothing unusual was found. The official report concluded that the isolation experiment had created unexpected psychological contagion, that the subjects and researcher had experienced shared delusions amplified by the darkness and extreme isolation of the Arctic winter. But Anthony kept copies of the security footage. Late at night, he reviews it frame by frame, studying the distortions, the shadows that move, with purpose. The entity that appeared in a facility designed to house only 7 people. And he's noticed something that wasn't in any official report. The entity appeared every night of the experiment, not just the nights they'd consciously observed it. It was there from day 1, visible as a slight distortion in the earliest footage. It had been in the facility before they arrived, moving through the corridors during the long Arctic darkness, and their presence hadn't summoned it. They'd simply finally noticed it was there. The research station at Prudhoe Bay is still operational, still used for isolation experiments, though protocols have been changed significantly. Subjects are no longer kept for more than 4 weeks. More monitoring staff are present, and researchers are instructed to report any unusual perceptions immediately, no matter how irrational they seem. But Anthony won't go back. He's left the field entirely, moving to a different area of research, somewhere with sunlight and people and the comforting noise of civilization. Because he understands now what lives in places of extreme isolation and darkness. Not ghosts, not anything supernatural in the traditional sense, but entities adapted to emptiness, to the spaces where humans rarely go, where the long darkness makes reality thin and permeable. And they're curious about us. They watch when we enter their territory, study our behavior, try to understand these brief, warm creatures who venture into the cold and dark. Anthony doesn't know what they are or where they come from. But he knows they're there, in the remote places, in the research stations and isolated cabins, in anywhere humans create pockets of light surrounded by endless darkness. And he knows they're patient. They'll wait through the summer, through the light, for winter to return, for darkness to reclaim its territory. And then they'll resume their watching, their studying, their careful observation of the humans who think they're alone in the Arctic night. Story 8. The Ice Cave Expedition. Rebecca Hart had been a professional cave explorer for 12 years, but the ice caves beneath the Matanuska Glacier represented her most ambitious expedition. The 41-year-old from Colorado specialized in glacier caves, temporary formations created by meltwater, constantly shifting, deadly if you didn't respect their dangers. In March of 2024, she assembled a team to map a newly discovered cave system that penetrated deep into the glacier, potentially reaching formations that were thousands of years old. Her team consisted of herself, two experienced cavers named Michael Torres and Linda Yamamoto, and their guide, an Atna Athabaskan man named Daniel Nikolai, who'd grown up near the glacier and knew its moods better than anyone. They entered the cave system on March 7th, equipped with full technical gear, multiple light sources, GPS beacons, and supplies for a 3-day expedition. The entrance was spectacular, a mouth of blue ice 20 feet high, water running across smooth, frozen floor. They descended into a world of impossible beauty, ice formations in shades of blue and white, light refracting through crystal structures, chambers that looked like cathedrals built by alien architects. Rebecca documented everything, taking photographs and measurements, mapping the cave system with laser equipment. They made good progress the first day, penetrating almost a mile into the glacier. The caves were more stable than expected, the ice formations suggesting this section hadn't experienced significant melt-refreeze cycles in years. They established camp in a large chamber, ate dinner, and reviewed the next day's planned route. Daniel was quiet during the meal, his expression troubled. When Rebecca asked what was wrong, he hesitated before speaking. "My grandmother's people didn't enter glacier caves. They said the ice holds memories. Everything that's ever been frozen in it, preserved forever. And some of those memories are dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Michael asked. "The ice remembers the world before humans, remembers things that lived when the glaciers covered everything. And sometimes, if you go deep enough, those memories become active." Rebecca respected local traditions, but she was also a scientist. The caves were geological formations, nothing more. She thanked Daniel for sharing the story and assured him they'd be careful. They settled into sleeping bags, and exhaustion claimed them quickly. Rebecca woke to Linda's voice, urgent but controlled. "Everyone wake up, look at the walls." Rebecca fumbled for her headlamp and immediately understood Linda's concern. The ice walls of their chamber had changed. They'd been smooth when they'd set up camp, but now they were covered in formations, not natural formations, but shapes. Figures, dozens of them preserved in the ice like three-dimensional silhouettes. They surrounded the chamber, frozen in various poses, some standing, some crouched, all oriented toward the center of the room where the team had made camp. "That's not possible," Michael said, approaching the nearest figure. "These would take hours to form, and we've only been asleep for, 4 hours?" Rebecca checked her watch. 3:42 a.m. They'd gone to sleep around 11. The formations couldn't have appeared naturally in that time, but the evidence was undeniable. They were encased in solid ice, integrated with the wall structure, not carved or artificially created. Daniel was staring at the figures with an expression of deep fear. "We need to leave. Now." "Let's not panic," Rebecca said, though her own pulse was racing. "There's probably a natural explanation. Maybe these formations were always here and we just didn't notice them in the dark. She approached one of the figures, examining it with her professional eye. The shape was roughly humanoid but wrong in proportions. Too tall, limbs slightly too long, head shape not quite right. And there was detail in the ice that shouldn't exist. She could see textures that suggested hair, the shadow of features, even what might have been clothing. This wasn't a random formation. This was something that had been preserved, frozen in the ice exactly as it had died. Over the next 20 minutes, Rebecca's team examined the chamber systematically. Every wall held figures, at least 50 in total, all facing inward, and they found something else. The ice here was old, incredibly old. Rebecca took a core sample for dating. Her equipment suggested this ice had formed at least 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age. Whatever these are, Linda said quietly. They've been here since before modern humans reached North America. They should have left then. Every instinct screamed for evacuation. But Rebecca's scientific curiosity overrode caution. This was a discovery, potentially a significant one. Megafauna from the Pleistocene epoch. Some unknown species preserved in the ice. They needed to document it properly, collect samples, alert the appropriate institutions. They spent the next 6 hours working the chamber, photographing every figure, taking ice samples, creating a detailed map. The work was meticulous and exhausting. And as the hours passed, Rebecca began to notice something strange. The figures weren't in exactly the same positions they'd been when she'd first examined them. Subtle shifts, an arm at a different angle, a head turned slightly more toward the center of the chamber. She told herself it was observation bias, that she was remembering incorrectly. But the photographs confirmed it. The figures were moving, infinitesimally slowly, but definitely moving. "We're leaving," Daniel announced at 10 a.m. "Whatever's happening here, I want no part of it." But when they returned to the tunnel they'd entered through, they found it had changed. The passage was narrower, the ice formations different. Rebecca checked her GPS. They were in the correct location, but the cave itself had reconfigured. Ice caves were dynamic, she knew that, but this degree of change in such a short time was impossible. They tried 3 other tunnels leading from the chamber. Each led deeper into the glacier, none led back toward the surface. And with each hour, the figures in the walls emerged more clearly from the ice. Details became visible that hadn't been there before, eyes, mouths, hands reaching out. It was as if something was pushing them forward, birthing them from the ancient ice after 20,000 years of frozen sleep. By evening of the second day, the team was trapped. Every passage led further in or ended in solid ice. Their GPS beacons showed them moving in circles despite following careful navigation. And the figures had emerged to the point where their surfaces were no longer encased in ice but exposed to air. Michael reached out to touch one and it crumbled, not into ice but into ash. Fine gray ash that scattered across the floor of the cave. He jumped back and they watched as the entire figure collapsed, leaving a hollow space in the ice where it had been. "They're not preserved," Linda whispered, "and they're already dead. Have been for millennia. The ice is just holding their shape." But if that was true, what did it mean that they'd been moving? The answer came at 3:42 a.m. on the third day. Rebecca woke to a sound like wind through the caves, except they were too deep for surface wind to reach. The sound resolved into something else, breathing, dozens of entities breathing in synchronization. And the figures were no longer in the walls. They stood throughout the chamber, shapes made of ash and ice and memory. Not solid, not quite present, but there nonetheless. Rebecca could see through them, see their hollow interiors where nothing remained of whatever they'd been 20,000 years ago. But they moved, they breathed. They watched the 4 humans with attention that felt ancient and hungry. Daniel was praying in his language, words Rebecca didn't understand. Michael and Linda were pressed together, paralyzed by fear. Rebecca forced herself to think scientifically, to observe rather than panic. The entities weren't advancing, weren't attacking. They were just there, existing. Perhaps they'd been sleeping in the ice for 20 millennia, and the team's presence, their warmth, their lights had woken them. One of the figures approached Rebecca. Up close, she could see it more clearly. Tall, humanoid but not human, features that suggested intelligence. It reached out with a hand made of ash, and where it touched her jacket, the fabric frosted instantly, ice crystals spreading from the point of contact. The entity tilted its head, and Rebecca had the strangest sensation. It was confused. It didn't understand what she was, this warm, living thing that had entered its frozen domain. And it was trying to communicate, sending impressions directly into her mind. Images of a world covered in ice. Creatures like this one moving across frozen continents, hunting, building, living in the cold. And then warmth coming. Glaciers melting. Their entire civilization being erased by climate change that happened too fast for them to adapt. They'd retreated into the glaciers as a last refuge. Let the ice preserve them, hoping to wait out the warmth and re-emerge when the world turned cold again. But the cold hadn't returned. They'd slept for 20,000 years while the Ice Age ended and humans inherited a warmer world. And now they were waking to find themselves extinct. Nothing remaining but ash and memories frozen in ancient ice. The entity withdrew its hand. Rebecca's jacket was white with frost, but she was unharmed. The creature, all of them, began to fade, collapsing back into ash, the ash dissipating like smoke. Within minutes, the chamber was empty except for the 4 humans and hollows in the ice where the figures had been. The caves released them that morning. A passage opened. Rebecca couldn't say whether it was new or had been there all along, leading steadily upward. They emerged onto the glacier's surface at noon on day 4, and a helicopter that had been searching for them spotted them almost immediately. The official report stated that the team had become disoriented in the cave system, experiencing hallucinations brought on by stress and possible hypoxia. The ice samples Rebecca collected showed no unusual properties. The photographs of the figures were dismissed as natural ice formations misinterpreted due to lighting and psychological stress. But Rebecca knows what she saw, what she experienced. Something lived during the Ice Age, something intelligent and adapted to cold. And when the world warmed, they retreated into the glaciers hoping to survive. Most of them died, but some remained frozen in the ice, not quite alive but not completely gone. And as climate change accelerates and the glaciers melt, these ancient preservations are being exposed. What happens when entities from the Pleistocene epoch wake to find the world has moved on without them? What do they do with their hunger, their confusion, their grief for a lost world? Rebecca doesn't know. But she thinks about the glacier caves, about the figures still trapped in ancient ice, waiting for the melt to reach them. And she wonders what will emerge as Alaska's glaciers continue to recede, what memories will become active again, and whether humanity is prepared to meet the things that remember when they ruled a world of ice. Story 9. The Village That Moved. Nathan Okonek had been a bush pilot for 23 years, flying supplies and passengers across Alaska's remote villages. At 51, he'd seen almost everything the last frontier could throw at him. Whiteout conditions, engine failures, emergency landings on frozen lakes. But the village of Akiak River tested even his experience. In February of 2024, he accepted a cargo run to deliver medical supplies to the village, which sat on the Kuskokwim River Delta, accessible only by air or boat. The flight from Bethel should have taken 45 minutes. Nathan knew the route. He'd flown it dozens of times. But when he reached the coordinates where Akiak River should have been, he found only empty tundra. No village, no airstrip, no signs of habitation. just frozen river and endless white landscape. Nathan circled 3 times, checking his navigation. GPS confirmed he was at the correct location. His heading was accurate, weather clear, visibility good. But Akiak River, a village of 83 people that had existed for over a century, was simply gone. He radioed Bethel Flight Operations. "This is November 7-3 Mike. I'm at Akiak River coordinates, but there's no village here. Repeat, no structures visible." Long silence then. 7-3 Mike. Confirm your position. Nathan read off his coordinates. Another pause. 7-3 Mike. Those coordinates are correct for Akiak River. Village should be visible from your position. Are you experiencing equipment malfunction? Nathan checked every instrument. Everything functioned normally. Negative on equipment malfunction. I have clear visibility and correct position. But there's no village here. He expanded his search pattern, flying grid searches around the coordinates. After 30 minutes, he spotted structures about 3 miles east of where they should have been. A cluster of buildings, smoke from chimneys, an airstrip. He approached and confirmed. This was Akiak River. Same church, same school building, same layout. But 3 miles from where it had been on every map, every GPS database, every previous flight he'd made to this location. Nathan landed, perplexed but relieved. The village council leader, a woman named Sarah Aguchak, met him at the airstrip. "You had trouble finding us?" she asked. "The village moved," Nathan said flatly. "Or my navigation is completely wrong. How long have you been at this location?" Sarah's expression became unreadable. "The village has always been here," she said carefully. But Nathan had 23 years of flight logs that said different. He'd landed at Akiak River at specific coordinates dozens of times. Now those coordinates showed empty tundra, and the village sat 3 miles east. Villages didn't move. It was impossible. The infrastructure, the buildings, the cemetery, you couldn't relocate everything. He unloaded the medical supplies and asked questions. The residents gave him the same answer. The village had always been at this location. But when he asked to see old photographs, maps, any documentation of the village's location, people became evasive. Sarah finally pulled him aside. "Some things aren't for outsiders to understand," she said quietly. "The village is where it needs to be. It always has been. That's all you need to know." Nathan left confused but assumed there was some explanation. Maybe he'd been flying to a seasonal camp and this was the main village. Maybe his memory was faulty. He filed his flight report noting the different coordinates and forgot about it. Until 3 weeks later when he had another cargo run to Akiak River. He filed a flight plan for the new coordinates, the location where he'd found the village on the previous trip. But when he arrived, the village was gone again. Empty tundra at those coordinates. He expanded his search and found Akiak River 4 miles north of its previous location. Same buildings, same people, different place. This time, Sarah wasn't surprised to see him confused. "The village moves," she admitted. "It's always moved. Our ancestors knew. You don't stay in one place during the dark times. Things can find you if you stay still." "Things?" Nathan asked. "There are stories," Sarah said, "about what walks the tundra during polar night, about why villages must move, why staying in one location too long is dangerous. The elders remember. We've been doing this for generations, longer than white people have been mapping Alaska. The village moves when it needs to." Nathan tried to understand. "You're telling me the entire village, buildings, people, everything, physically relocates every few weeks?" "Not physically," Sarah said. "The village is here. The buildings don't move. We don't pack up and rebuild, but where here is, that changes. The village stays in one place, but that place moves through the land. I know it doesn't make sense to you. It doesn't make sense to us either, but it's how we've survived." Over the next 4 months, Nathan made 6 more trips to Akiak River. Each time he found it at different coordinates, sometimes 5 miles from the previous location, once over 10 miles. The village itself never changed, but its position relative to fixed landmarks shifted constantly, and none of the residents seemed concerned. They lived their lives normally, as if their entire community randomly relocating was perfectly natural. Nathan began researching. He found historical records of Akiak River dating back to the early 1900s with coordinates listed. But the coordinates changed year by year, sometimes month by month. He found reports from other pilots describing the same phenomenon. Akiak River was never quite where it was supposed to be. And he found older records, Russian and native Alaskan sources describing villages along the Kuskokwim that moved with the seasons or could not be found by those who meant harm. He found a journal from a missionary in 1923. The village of Akiak River evades mapping. I have visited 6 times and each time reach it by a different route. The natives claim this is protection, that the village must move to avoid something they will not name. I suspect navigational errors on my part, but cannot explain the consistency of the phenomenon. Nathan became obsessed. He installed additional tracking equipment on his plane, used multiple independent GPS systems, took careful notes of landmarks. The data was undeniable. Akiak River's position changed, typically every 2 to 3 weeks, moving in what seemed like a random pattern across a roughly 30-square-mile area. But there was a pattern. Nathan plotted every location on a map and noticed that the village never appeared in certain areas. There were gaps, dead zones where Akiak River never relocated. And when he overlaid historical maps, he found something chilling. The gaps corresponded with locations where other villages had once existed, villages that no longer appeared on any maps, places that had simply vanished from records. He flew over one of the gap areas, a location where Akiak River never appeared. His instruments went haywire, compass spinning, GPS losing signal, radio producing only static. He descended for a better look and saw something that made his blood freeze. There were structures down there, a village, or the remains of one. Buildings half collapsed, partially buried in snow and ice. But they didn't look abandoned through neglect. They looked consumed, as if something had fed on them, leaving only husks. And moving among the ruins was something dark, something that flowed more than walked, covering the ground like spreading oil. Nathan pulled up sharply, fighting his instruments back to normal function. He didn't look back, didn't try to understand what he'd seen. He returned to Bethel and immediately filed for 2 weeks off, claiming equipment concerns. His last flight to Akiak River was in June of 2024. He found the village nestled against a river bend that hadn't been there on any previous visit. Sarah met him again, and this time she seemed older, more tired. "The village is getting harder to move," she said. "The young people don't understand why we do it. They want permanent homes, internet, things that require staying in one place. But the elders know. During the dark months when the sun is gone, there are things on the tundra that hunt for settlements. They can find you if you stay still, if you let roots grow too deep, so we move. We've always moved. What happens if you stop?" Nathan asked. Sarah looked toward the horizon, toward the areas Nathan had learned to avoid. "There used to be 18 villages in this region," she said. "Now there's 1. The others stopped moving. They thought they were safe, that the old ways were superstition, and one by one they were found." Nathan never flew to Akiak River again. He transferred to routes that served larger, permanent communities. But sometimes, looking at maps of the Kuskokwim Delta, he'd notice something odd. Villages would appear on updated charts in locations where the previous year's maps showed empty tundra. Not new construction, but existing villages, as if cartographers kept making mistakes about where places actually were. And he'd remember Akiak River. Remember a community that survived by refusing to stay in one place, by moving through the land in ways that defied conventional understanding. And he'd wonder how many other Alaska villages did the same thing. How many communities had learned that survival sometimes meant embracing impossibility, meant accepting that the rules governing the rest of the world didn't apply in the far north where darkness ruled for months, and things moved across the tundra that maps would never show. Akiak River is still there if you know how to find it. But don't rely on coordinates, don't trust your GPS. Listen instead to the people who've lived there for generations, who understand that some places must move to survive, who know that staying in one location too long means being found by things that still hunt in the Alaska darkness, patient and hungry and waiting for prey that holds still. Story 10. The Last Broadcast. Melissa Wang had been a radio journalist for Anchorage Public Radio for 9 years, specializing in stories from Alaska's remote communities. At 33, she prided herself on going places other reporters avoided, telling stories from the edges of civilization. In January of 2024, she traveled to the remote community of Arctic Village to report on how traditional cultures adapt to rapidly changing climate conditions. Arctic Village sat north of the Arctic Circle, population around 150, accessible only by air. Melissa flew in on a clear January day when the sun briefly appeared on the horizon for less than 2 hours, before sinking back into polar night. She planned a week-long stay, conducting interviews, recording ambient sound, building a comprehensive portrait of life in one of Alaska's most isolated communities. The village had limited electricity, no cell service, and internet that functioned sporadically. Melissa stayed with a local family and spent her days interviewing elders, hunters, teachers, anyone willing to share their perspective. Her equipment was simple: a professional audio recorder, microphones, and a satellite phone for emergencies. On her 4th night, Melissa was reviewing the day's recordings in the small cabin room she'd been given. She scrolled through files, listening to snippets, making notes for her eventual story. Then she found a file she hadn't recorded. The timestamp showed it had been created at 3:17 a.m. the previous night, hours when she'd been asleep, her equipment powered off and packed away. She clicked play. Static filled her headphones, then a voice emerged, female, speaking English but with an accent Melissa couldn't place. The words were clear. "If you're hearing this, you're listening at the wrong time. This broadcast isn't for you. This frequency is reserved for those who are no longer here, who exist in the spaces between your moments. We're speaking to them, not to you. Please stop listening. You're interrupting something important." The recording ended. Melissa stared at her equipment, pulse racing. Her recorder had been off, locked in her bag. There was no way it could have captured audio. She checked the file metadata, definitely created by her device, definitely recorded at 3:17 a.m. But that was impossible. She tried to delete the file, but it wouldn't erase. Error messages filled the screen. File protected, access denied, deletion failed. Fine, she'd deal with it later. Probably some equipment glitch, corrupted data presenting as an audio file. But the next morning, Melissa noticed people in the village behaving strangely. They'd stop mid-conversation, heads tilted as if listening to something. When she asked what they were hearing, they'd look confused, insist they hadn't heard anything. But she'd seen it. A moment of absolute focus, of listening to something Melissa couldn't perceive. That night, another file appeared on her recorder. Same timestamp, 3:17 a.m. Same voice, but different words. "You're still listening. We asked you to stop. The broadcasts aren't for living ears. You're creating interference, making it harder for them to hear. The ones we're calling, the ones who used to live in these places, they're trying to respond, but your attention is drowning them out. Please, stop listening." Melissa was fully awake now, staring at equipment that had definitely been powered off. She checked every setting, every possibility for remote access or timer recording. Nothing explained it. And the voice on the recordings, it didn't sound like a prank. It sounded genuinely distressed, genuinely worried about Melissa's interference. She researched radio phenomena, atmospheric conditions that might cause equipment to pick up stray broadcasts. The Arctic could do strange things to radio signals, bouncing them off the ionosphere, creating transmissions that traveled thousands of miles. Maybe her recorder was picking up broadcasts from Russia, from ships in the Arctic Ocean, from military installations. But the recordings kept appearing. Every night at 3:17 a.m., a new file. The voice began describing things. Places in Arctic Village, specific locations, details that suggested the speaker knew the community intimately. She described houses that no longer existed, people who had died years before, events from decades past. And she spoke directly to those people, calling them by name, asking them questions, having one-sided conversations with the dead. Melissa started staying awake until 3:17 a.m., determined to catch the recordings happening in real time. On the sixth night, she sat in the darkness of her room, recorder in front of her, watching the clock on her satellite phone. At 3:16 a.m., the temperature dropped, not gradually but instantly, from tolerable to bone-chilling cold in seconds. Melissa's breath fogged heavily and frost began forming on the windows. Her recorder's power light flickered on, though she hadn't touched it. At 3:17 a.m., the voice filled the room. Not from the recorder, from the air itself, coming from every direction at once. "There you are, finally listening in real time. I can see you now, see that you're living, breathing, warm. You need to understand. This village exists in multiple times simultaneously. The living inhabit one stream, moving forward through moments. But there are others, those who died here, whose stories ended in this place. They exist in different streams, parallel times that overlap with yours during the deep darkness." Melissa wanted to speak, to ask questions, but terror had locked her throat. The voice continued. "We broadcast to them, help them find each other across time. Arctic Village has existed for centuries. Thousands have lived and died here. During polar night, when darkness rules for months, the boundaries between time streams thin. The dead can hear each other, can communicate, can exist in community again. But living interference disrupts the frequencies. Your attention, your listening. It creates static in their world." The cold intensified. Melissa could see shapes in her room now, translucent figures that flickered in and out of visibility. They moved like living people, walking, sitting, interacting, but they weren't solid, weren't quite present. And they were everywhere, dozens of them, filling a space that should barely hold one person. "You're seeing them now," the voice said. "The others who exist in this room across different times, 100 years of people who've occupied this space, all present simultaneously when the darkness allows. They can see you too. You're the disruption, the living person intruding on their shared moment." The figures turned toward Melissa. Faces from different eras, traditional clothing, modern dress, styles spanning decades. All looking at her with expressions ranging from confusion to sorrow to anger. She was the intruder, the living person crashing into their gathering. One figure approached, an elderly woman in traditional Gwich'in clothing, her face weathered and kind. She reached out and Melissa felt cold that went beyond physical temperature. The touch carried memories, impressions, a lifetime of experience compressed into a moment. The woman had died in this village 60 years ago. She existed now in the parallel time stream, and during these dark months she could return. could be part of the community again. The woman spoke, but Melissa heard it only in her mind. Go back to your time, child. This darkness isn't for the living. We gather here because we have nowhere else. The dead need community too. Need to remember we existed, that our lives mattered. But you need to leave. Your warmth, your life. It's disrupting our cohesion. Melissa stumbled backward, breaking the contact. The cold receded slightly. The voice in the air spoke again. The broadcast will end when polar night ends, when the sun returns and the time streams separate again. Until then, please stop listening. Let the dead have their time, their community, their voices. You have the whole living world. Let them have these few dark weeks. The figures faded. The temperature returned to normal. Melissa's recorder clicked off. A new file saved. The final recording. When she checked it later, it contained everything: the voice, her own racing heartbeat, the sound of figures moving through the room, whispers in languages she didn't recognize. Melissa left Arctic Village the next morning, claiming a family emergency. She never completed her story about climate adaptation. How could she? The real story. That remote Alaska villages existed in multiple times, simultaneously during polar night, that the dead gathered in parallel streams, that broadcasts connected them across decades. That story would never air on public radio. She kept the recordings but never listened to them again. The files remained on her device, protected and undeletable. A record of something she witnessed but couldn't explain. She left journalism 6 months later, unable to continue reporting when she knew there were stories happening just out of phase with living perception, communities existing in darkness that the living world would never acknowledge. Arctic Village still broadcasts every winter night at 3:17 a.m. If you're there during polar night, if you're listening at the right or wrong time, you might hear it. Voices calling names of people who died decades ago. Conversations across time. The dead maintaining their community in the darkness, gathering in the same spaces they knew in life, refusing to be forgotten. And if you listen too closely, if you pay too much attention, you might see them. Figures from different eras, all present simultaneously, all looking back at you with the question, why are the living intruding on our time? We had our years of sunlight and warmth. These dark weeks are ours. Let us have them. Melissa never returned to the Arctic. She moved to Phoenix, where winter means mild temperatures and darkness lasts only a few hours. She tells people she wanted a change, wanted sun and warmth. But the truth is simpler. She learned that some communities exist outside of linear time, that the dead refuse to stay in the past, and that during Alaska's long darkness, the boundaries between living and dead, between past and present, grow dangerously thin. And she learned that some broadcasts aren't meant for living ears, that some frequencies carry conversations the living were never supposed to hear. The dead have their own stories, their own communities, their own time, and in the far north, during the deepest darkness, they reclaim the spaces they knew in life, gathering in parallel moments while the living sleep, unaware that they're sharing their homes with dozens of others who exist just out of phase with the present.